friends are since.
If you are watching this video, then it's probably because you're curious about how the Dirtywave M8 operates in practice. Now, I've already done a series of 3 tutorial videos that cover the kind of main elements of the M8 as I see them, but lots of people have been asking me to do more videos on different parts of the M8, and so I'm going to do a few different videos going through some of the features that I think are particularly interesting or worth talking about. Now, in this video, I'm going to take a look at scale mode. This is a relatively recent addition to the M8, and it's something that wasn't or isn't present in LSDJ as far as I'm aware of. So if you're coming from that world of Game Boy music creation with LSDJ, then this will probably be brand new to you. Maybe not the concept, hopefully not the concept, but the implementation at least. Now this was only added in firmware version 2.5.0 onto the M8, and it was also updated in version 2.5.3. So be sure that you're running that version of the firmware at least, or you're not going to be able to see what I'm talking about. Now here I've got my M8, which is connected, oh there you go, my M8 which is connected up to my computer. That's how I'm recording this video. You'll notice that my screen color matches my fetching custom colored keycaps. If you're interested in them, I dye my own keycaps and sell them sometimes. I was selling them on Etsy, but Etsy are a joke. So I've set up my own shop and I'll link that below. So if you've got an M8 or you're getting one and you want to change up your colour scheme, then go have a look at that. Anyway, as the name suggests, scale mode acts as a quantiser, which restricts the available pitches to a particular scale and key signature. Now, if you've ever used something like the Launchpad Pro or something like Machine maybe, this concept won't be all that difficult to understand. Basically, it means that the pads or the notes are restricted so that you can be sure that you're always playing in tune, or in key, I guess I should say. And this can be really handy, especially if you don't know any music theory, or maybe you're just not confident in making music by ear, or maybe you just want some inspiration for a different kind of key than you usually work in because you always write music in the same scale like myself. Whatever it is, that's what the scale mode and quantiser are useful for. Now, in order to access scale mode, we first of all have to create a chain and then a phrase. Any empty one will do, but if you don't have one, then you can't access that menu. So we've created our chain and our phrase, and then once we get to the phrase menu, you'll see in the bottom right, if we go up one, that takes us to the groove menu screen, and now there's this S above there, which isn't present in the previous firmware versions. If we go up one more, you can see we now get to scale mode. In here you can load and define a whole pile of different scales, as well as changing the relevant root note. So for example, at the moment the key is in C, but if we change that, we can change it to any of the notes as you might expect. All of the notes even, I guess. Anyway, by default, there are 92 different scales included with the M8, and you can see all of these if you go down to load. They're contained within factory. When you upgrade to the relevant firmware version, it loads them in at power up, I believe. But there are piles and piles of scales in here of all sorts of weird and wonderful kinds. Now, if we pick just a random one and load it up, you'll see that the enabled notes in the scale screen change. So for example, here, because we're in the augmented scale in C, then we have C, no C sharp, no D, D sharp is there, etc. And that's how it works. Now, if you want to define your own scale, you can do that really easily by manually editing the notes. So let's say we've got an augmented C scale, but we want to throw in an F for some ungodly reason. Then all you do is enable it, and that way F is now allowed within that scale, and you can save this as a custom scale with whatever name you might want to give it. If you look over here, there's an offset, and so if you're into the kind of microtonal stuff, then this is where you would set it up and, you know, adjust things so that you could get your microtonal scale, which is surprisingly difficult to say. But the range here on the offset is -24 to +24, and that's in semitones, which means that you've got a fairly huge range of different semitones that you can create your own scales there. Now, all of that is far beyond my meagre mind, so I'm not going to pretend to know more about microtonal scales than I actually do, but the option is there for those smarter than I. Now in practice, what this means is that if you go back and create a new phrase or a new pattern, you're only going to be able to select the notes from the enabled scale. So for example, in this case, we're in the augmented scale. We cannot select C sharp or D or F sharp. And if we go into the phrase and try and do it, you'll see that that can't happen. Essentially, it's just skipping the available notes or the notes which are not enabled within the scale, which is really smart because it means when you're composing, you can force yourself into a particular scale like this. If I create an instrument, just to let you hear what's going on, it means when you cycle through the available notes, you'll hear that is stepped within the scale. So that is very high pitched. And obviously some of these scales will be more melodically pleasing in their intervals than others. Now what happens if, let's say, we have a scale or we have a phrase which was created whilst there is no scale, or at least a chromatic scale, which means that all of the notes are present, and then we apply another scale. Well, if we do, let's say, just try for argument's sake, F, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D. Now, if I then go in and apply a scale which doesn't include some of those notes that are in my pre-existing pattern, for example, I don't know, harmonic minor, that should mean that the A sharp, C sharp will not play. So this note here, and let's make this, yeah, so C sharp and A sharp are not within the scale that I have now selected. So what actually happens if I play my existing pattern with that scale enabled? Well, let's find out. I will have to create an instrument, of course, for you to hear this. I'll also give it a very brief envelope so we're not bowled over by the drone. So let's press play. Now it might not be immediately clear what's going on at this point, but if we go up and look at the scale, you'll see that the scale marker or the arrow, when it comes to one of those notes that's not within the scale that is actually applied, it is sticking to the nearest note within the allowable or legal notes. And this is essentially how a quantiser works. And if you've ever used auto-tune or something like that, not that I have, because I am clearly, you know, I've got perfect pitch and sing like an angel, but if you have used the auto-tune, you might be familiar with the way that you know, the wee keyboard will stick to the closest note that is actually within the scale. And very handily, in one of the recent firmware versions, it might be 2.5.0 as well, we've got this wee keyboard sign, which is, I can't figure out which way the screen goes, but it's down there? Yeah, down there. You can see if I press play that you'll be able to see where the notes are actually landing. And so this does mean you need to know what the notes on the keyboard are if you want to kind of get the most information out of this. But if you look down at that keyboard or virtual keyboard, you'll see when the notes are sticking on a particular note so that they remain within the scale. Anyway, that's how that works. It's a really nice feature. Now, the real power of trackers, and the M8 in particular, is the ability to define things on a more granular level, and the scales are no exception to this. The default global scale, if we go in, is chromatic, which means that all of the notes are in there. However, you can change this to whatever you want by loading up a different scale. And this scale, scale 00, is the globally applied scale to every track and every kind of parameter within the M8. However, there are 16 different scales that you can have loaded and have available to use within your projects. So if I hold down Option and go right, you'll see that I start to go up through a whole variety of different scales that are preloaded into the 16 different slots. many of which I have no understanding of whatsoever. However, this gives you the opportunity or the ability to do some quite clever things. For example, each of these 8 tracks can be, or sorry, each of the 8 tracks within the M8, I should say, can each be assigned a different scale and key signature. And you do this by using the SCA effects command. So if you've watched my other videos, you should know about effects commands. But it's essentially, you can apply steps, or you can apply effects per step and also per micro step, but we won't get into that. The way you would do this is by adding in the SCA command. You can see that the first digit here is the key, so that's the root note, and the second digit is the scale. And very helpfully, if we start to cycle through, you'll see that down the bottom there, it tells you not just the root note, but also the scale that you're selecting. And obviously that will go up through the 16 that are available that you have loaded in. So you can't go through all the 92 or anything. You do have to have one of 16, but surely that should be enough. Now this means that you can change the scale or the key of your song as you're going through the song. Maybe you could change it depending on the instrument that you've got. Maybe you could change it depending on, you know, which part of the song you're in, and you want 2 different tracks to run at different scales that complement each other. All of these things become a possibility. And this is also coupled with the ability to change the global scale at any point. So rather than having to change it per track, you can go in and you can use SCG effects command, global scale. It works the same way as SCA, apart from it applies globally rather than just for the one track. Now the other cool thing is that you can also choose to have individual instruments respect or ignore the relevant scale by editing the transpose option in the instrument parameters. So if we wanted, say, instrument 1 to ignore the scale, but we wanted other instruments to respect the scale, we go into the instrument 1 page. We have to go up the way into the, I don't know what the E stands for, I should know that, but whatever. You can see here there's a transpose option. It is on by default, but if we select that and turn it off, that means that this instrument globally will not respond or won't correspond to the scale or any transposition, which gives you an extra added layer of control, which is really quite nice indeed. And I guess that would be useful for things like drums, if you didn't want to, you know, put your hi-hats through a particular kind of scale or anything like that. Now, it doesn't stop there, because the scale also applies not just to note entry or transposition, like I've shown you already, but also to other commands within the M8. So for example, the scale will also apply to a variety of other effects that rely on pitch to make sense, which include things like the ARP command, which is the fast arpeggiation command, the pitch effect command, but also the pitch modulation modifier within the FM synth, which maybe I can show you in here. There's a pitch modulation in here somewhere, so obviously it makes sense for that to correspond to the scale, so that it all works nicely and sounds within key. But it also applies to the MIDI out, and it applies to the MIDI out specifically, or I guess including, with the chord and the add note commands. So CHD and ADD, both of these commands will also relate to the active scale, which is really nice because it means that your external gear, even when you're using MIDI specific commands in order to send chords, etc., will also stay nicely and in key, or nicely in key, I guess I should say. So that is the scale command. It's a really simple but incredibly useful feature, which has got all the control and power that you would expect from a tracker, and I think it's a really cool idea, and I'm glad that they've put it in here, because even though I tend to make music in the M8 by ear, I kind of find notes that I like, it can be easy to fall into the same patterns. And if you, especially with the kind of number of scales that are in here, you can pick one that you've never heard of, play about with it, and get some really interesting melodies or melodic kind of patterns that you would never necessarily come up with on your own. and that's pretty exciting. I hope that sparks some kind of ideas for what you can do with the M8 and the scale mode in particular. If there's any specific elements of the M8 that you're curious about, or just want an intro on, or whatever, sling me a comment below and I'll see what I can do. Obviously these are not in-depth parts of the M8, it's mostly trying to give you an introduction and an idea of the kind of thing that you might be able to do with it. I think lots of people are excitedly reading and watching everything they can while they either decide to pre-order or while they're waiting on their pre-order, so maybe this will be of interest and value. Anyway, for now, thank you for watching. Be careful out there.